All right, welcome back and thank you so much for joining us here on Morning Love. Now, recently, members of civil society created a People's Tribunal on Economic Crime in South Africa. This group urges members of the public to submit their information to be presented at the first hearings of Tribunal in November this year. So the organizations include Right to Know, Open Secrets, Corruption Wars, and Human Rights, amongst others. But according to these formations, failure of state institutions to fully investigate allegations of corruption and state capture has compelled them to make this call. Now, we're taking this discussion further, and we joined this morning by Michael Marchant. He's the researcher at Open Secrets. Good morning to you, Michael, and thank you so much for joining us here on Morning Live.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much. Just start by giving us a background on these hearings.
So I think that you've hit the nail on the head in one sense, in that this is civil society's response or a response from a range of civil society organizations that is a response to the failure of state institutions to what we feel is adequately investigate and prosecute allegations of corruption and state capture in South Africa. So that's the one thing that we're trying to do. We're trying to say that if the state is not going to move on some of these allegations, that we as the public can make strides in that regard. And so having open public hearings where we have these discussions can be a valuable step where the state is not acting. So that's the one thing. But I think the other important thing to note is that we seem to struggle in South Africa sometimes to have an open and honest discussion about the full legacy of economic crime and state capture. And I think there's a real appetite among South Africans now to discuss the current state capture, but in the context of the longer story of corruption and economic crime in South Africa. And so the tribunal very clearly aims to look at corruption and economic crime across three different eras, looking at the apartheid era, the late apartheid era from the late 1970s through the 1980s, and then into South Africa's democracy, and then looking at how those stories sort of link to what we see today with the allegations surrounding the president and other actors. Yeah,
I wanted to touch on that issue because we know that Open Secrets has actually brought to light some of the apartheid-era economic crimes, such as the arms trade, as you've correctly mentioned. So how far back are you accepting these submissions?
So at the moment, I mean, I think that there's an argument to be made from many people that in South Africa's case, you could go back hundreds of years, right? To understand the legacy of economic crime, one really needs to understand the legacy of colonialism. Obviously, for a tribunal of this nature, we are inherently limited by time and resources. And so we are going back 40 years to 1977. And that's a strategic choice. And the reason is that 1977 is the year that the United Nations places compulsory embargoes against the apartheid regime. And the apartheid state reacts with a range of essentially criminal networks in order to subvert those sanctions and get arms and oil into the country. And just to go back to what you've said, which is a really important point to note, is the reason we're going back to that era is that we see many of the same networks, many of the same actors, and many of the same crimes occurring in that period of sanctions busting that we do in the 1999 arms deal. Mm-hmm. And that is an event, I guess, that we could say has a fundamental effect on corruption in our politics. It compromises many of our politicians and particularly the ANC potentially as a party. And so we see those links in terms of those networks from the apartheid era arms sanctions busting to the 99 arms deal. And then again, I think that we could quite clearly draw the links between what we see now with the president who seems really intent on avoiding the charges, the 783 counts of corruption that again relate back to that arms deal. And that is so deeply intertwined with the allegations that we see today around state capture. So our argument is really that we can't fully understand what's happening around us now without looking backwards. And this is not about comparing the eras or having a strange discussion about what was worse. It's about really understanding the full story across those timeframes.
Yeah. So the focus is on state capture and corruption from what I'm gathering from you. And There are recent events in the country that have also given us a sense of the depth of corruption, not just in the public sector, but in the private sector as well. Is your focus just on state capture and state corruption, or will you also be looking into corruption within the private sector?
So we will certainly be looking into corruption in the private sector, but I think that what we would argue is that looking at state capture necessitates you looking at the private sector. Yeah. Actually, the fact that some actors want to argue that you can understand current allegations of corruption in state capture without a proper analysis of the private sector is deeply problematic. And we see this again across time. If we look at how the apartheid state managed to evade sanctions, they had the assistance of international banks, private banks, that profited from that system. We look at the 99 Arms deal. It is private European arms companies that are the primary beneficiaries of the money in that corrupt deal. And we look at now, as you said, serious allegations. There are further allegations arising this morning around McKinsey's role at Eskom and extracting billions of rand. KPMG's deep involvement in several scandals around current state capture. And so absolutely, I think each of the focus areas at the tribunal, we would welcome evidence that relates to both the states and private sector, with the understanding that these actors work together to compromise our politics.
All right, and you invite the public to submit their evidence. Talk to us about the process of the submission and what happens thereafter with that information.
So there are, as you mentioned, several organizations involved on the organizing committee of the tribunal who are preparing cases and evidence to be presented. Open Secrets, my organization, is acting as the secretariat for the group, and so all contact and all evidence can be submitted to us. And I would really encourage members of the public, even if you don't have evidence, if you'd like to find out more about the tribunal, or if you'd like to attend, you're welcome to contact us. You can go to the website corruptiontribunal.org.za, and all of the contact details are there. Once the evidence has been submitted, a range of witnesses and submissions will be put together, and they will be presented to a panel of independent adjudicators over the 5 days in November, from the 8th to the 12th. And we'll have a group of lawyers who will be assisting to lead that evidence and guide us through the process.
All right, so what happens thereafter? Will you be going to the courts maybe once you have evidence on a particular case?
So that's an important question. It's important to recognize that as civil society, we don't have the power of the state. And that's a great pity, because I think the allegations that we're talking about are very serious. And one of the reasons we're responding is that we feel the state has failed in that regard. And so we can't, of course, directly hold someone accountable. Where we see the power of the tribunal is that it's completely open to the public, and it provides the public with an important and accurate evidence-based record of crimes, both from our past and our present. And so that is a goal in and of itself. I think it's important for advocacy campaigns and just in general for our right to know as South African citizens to have that as a record. Yeah, but as you say, I think it provides also an opportunity for us to use the record, the documented evidence, to lobby institutions of state to take prosecutions forward, and to really heighten the call to draw attention to the fact that there's no excuse not to proceed with investigations and prosecutions from the side of the state.
All right. Michael, for now, we'll leave it at that, but thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, there you have it. That's Michael Marchant. He's a researcher at Open Secrets, talking to us about the recently launched People's Tribunal on Economic Crime. That is whereby South Africans are actually called to submit their evidence that they may be in possession of on state capture, corruption, or any other corruption taking place in South Africa.